Welcome everyone to Photography, Power and the Ethics of Representation, an antidote to performative activism, the first in a series of dialogues facilitated by Neelika Jayawardane with panelists Sama Al-Shaibi, Andrew Jackson, Zora J. Murph and Erin Turner. Thank you all for tuning in from various corners of the world. It is truly amazing that we're all able to listen and learn together in this way. My name is Amy Sodine, and I'm a researcher and curator at VIAD, the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center, where Neelika is a research associate. For those of you who are new to VIAD's work, we are a research center based at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and we support a global community of academics, curators, and artists. Today's panel forms part of VIAD's new digital platform entitled Reading the Moment. The platform is designed to share what members of our research community are thinking, feeling, and doing in response to conditions of racism and violence, as well as alternative possibilities enacted through radical as well as everyday practices of freedom, to quote Professor Anthony Boakes. If you would like to stay informed on upcoming Reading the Moment releases, please do sign up for the VIAD mailing list, and I'll place that link in the chat. VIAD would like to thank Lightwork, the Institute for Global Engagement at the State University of New York, Oswego, the English department at SUNY-Oswego, whose generous support has made this online conversation series possible. And for those who weren't able to join us, the conversation will be recorded and available on the VIAD website. We are honored to have you all with us today to talk about the power dynamics in decision-making processes at institutions as they concern matters of race and representation in photography. And so now we read an excerpt from Neelika's framing statement for today's dialogue, and she writes, quote, "In the last few months, the Black Lives Matter movement's ongoing activism and labor towards racial justice encouraged arts institutions to critically re-examine the ways in which their own practices are deeply imbricated in exclusionary and discriminatory practices. A few institutions began a far more long-term process of identifying how they might identify, challenge, and change their hiring practices, their work environments, and how their exhibitions, acquisitions, and grant-making processes are colored by unexamined, unconscious biases. But many simply reacted by doing performative activism, posting a black tile in honor of George Floyd's life on Instagram. These institutions, some of which do commendable work to support minoritized artists, chose to unsee deeply rooted practices of structural and systemic racism that are antithetical to their missions and public statements," end quote. As I've mentioned, Neelika is a research associate with VIAD and is an associate professor of English at SUNY-Oswego. She is the recipient of the 2018 Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for a book project on Afropix, a South African photographers agency that operated during the last decade of apartheid. And in introducing our panelists, Salma Al-Shaibi is a photographer and professor of photography, video, and imaging at the University of Arizona. Al-Shaibi is a Palestinian Iraqi born in Basra, Iraq, and currently resides in Tucson, Arizona. Andrew Jackson is a photographer and the co-founder and director of Reframed and is a full member of Diversify Photo. Jackson currently lives and works between the UK and Canada. Zora J. Murph is an assistant professor of art at the University of Arkansas School of Art. Murph is a co-founder and co-curator of Strange Fire Collective, a group of interdisciplinary artists, writers, and curators working to construct and promote an archive constituted by diverse makers. And Erin Turner is a photographer, artist, and curator based in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Erin currently works as a research fellow in photography at the University of Arkansas School of Art, where he founded and runs the Center for Photographers of Color, which seeks to promote the advancement of emerging and underrepresented artists of color working within photography, digital imaging, and other lens-based media. On behalf of VIAD, I would like to thank our panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And I would like to thank Neelika for bringing this incredibly important and much needed conversation to VIAD's program. Following our conversation, I will be facilitating a Q&A. So please do enter your question in the chat function so that it may be answered by the panelists. And with that, I will hand over to Neelika. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, all. I want to thank everyone for making this possible, especially to my two colleagues at VIAD at the University of Johannesburg, Amy and James, and especially Ulysses Mejias, who's the chair of IGE at SUNY-Oswego, who helped facilitate some of the funding, the chair of my department, Lee Wilson, and our incredibly supportive tech department. And thank you all for registering and coming to this conversation. I know that Zoom occupies a lot of our lives, so I appreciate that you've chosen to spend some of that time with us. In the past few months, the Black Lives Matter movement's ongoing activism and labor towards racial justice encouraged arts institutions to critically re-examine the ways in which their own practices are deeply imbricated in exclusionary and discriminatory practices. A few institutions began a far more long-term process of identifying how they might challenge and change their hiring practices, their work environments, and how their exhibitions, acquisitions, and grant-making processes are colored by unexamined, unconscious biases. But many simply reacted by doing performative activism, posting a black tile in honor of George Floyd's life on Instagram. These institutions, some of which do commendable work to support minoritized artists, chose to unsee deeply rooted practices of structural and systemic racism that are antithetical to their missions and public statements. I don't know if you are on Twitter, but the British Museum was laughed off particularly loudly because of the fact that they posted a Black Lives Matter kind of statement, but all their acquisitions, all their work is, or nearly all of it, is stolen from the colonies in Asia and Africa with no provenance whatsoever. So through many conversations I was having with artists, writers, and scholars and critics of visual culture, I came to realize that there was a pressing need to initiate some thoughtful and responsive programming that address some of the most prevalent institutional practices that often go unchallenged. If I, as an individual, identified and brought attention to these practices, I found that those in leadership positions quickly protected themselves by resorting to a series of predictable practices, including stonewalling, disavowal, and deflection to avoid having to take meaningful action. My initial thought process about these issues began in response to a specific instance. A photography organization on which I am a board member, or was a board member, invited a white Italian artist whose work attempted to speak to the history of slavery and continuing presence of the remnants of discrimination in upstate New York. His project was meant to be a worldwide project tracing the roots of history around the world, which seems impossible. Oddly enough, his work, which was focused on Black people from poorer communities in the upstate New York region, was not only deeply imbricated in racist iconography, but working in the tradition of white photographers who examine their ignorance and unconscious racism through looking at and photographing Black people. The visual tropes on which he relied were not uncommon. They are part of an identifiable, often repeated set of visual tropes that white artists employ when depicting Black and other minoritized people, historically and in contemporary times. In fact, these aesthetics, practices, and institutional rewards for white artists and those artists whose work engages with this tradition of representing the other are depressingly common. But none of this is altogether a shock. You've seen him. He's that guy who has continuously been awarded and rewarded with residencies and sales of his work because curators and directors at institutions much like the one on which I was a board member, have not extricated themselves from examining the dynamics that produce such exoticized imagery of minoritized people in the name of artistic freedom. Collectors too are partial to this kind of indulgence. A photographer examining his own ignorance of racism, having an awakening, but really not revealing anything new and reproducing the same old gaze. The art institution's seemingly benign decision to invite him rather than any other artist and give his work a platform through an artist residency, as well as a gallery exhibition and a speaking engagement, helped me see how well-intentioned efforts of both individuals and institutions reproduce discriminatory and exclusionary practices in the long term. When an institution gives awards, residencies, and exhibition space to an artist who pictures minoritized communities in this manner, they further elevate, legitimize, and normalize the same old racist ways of how that community is imaged and visualized. I could see the problems about this artist's work immediately. Engaging with Black, anti-colonial, and feminist scholarship will help anyone better understand how powerful racist structures continue to direct our ways of creating logic and meaning through images, that beautiful, necessary, and exhausting labor of those scholars and artists have shown us how those structures have worked for centuries to devalue and exclude Black and other minoritized people's ways of seeing, imaging, and narrativizing themselves. So I was wondering, if I could see it, why could my colleagues not? And why had the artist not educated himself either, when his work was focused on that very premise? I voiced my concerns about this particular artist's project and extensively detailed the reasons why I could not accept the institution's invitation to be the interlocutor at his talk. Over a number of conversations, detailed emails, in person, and during board meetings, I explained how this work and the organization's decision to give multiple sources of funding to platform this artist and his work over that of Black artists were a problem. On two separate occasions, once in an email and another during a board meeting, I was told that asking the organizational leadership to consider the problematic structures that, and their unconscious biases that, and maybe even thoughtlessness at times that rewarded white male artists when they produced work in a colonial and racist tradition. But the response was that what I was saying was tantamount to dangerous censorship. And you know where that conversation goes. So it was then that I had to spell things out times two. And I quote myself here, "There is no shortage of white men photographing Black people, especially in African countries. There is no shortage of white photographers who either vilify or exoticize. No one is, quote, censoring those photographers. And photographing various poor Black folk is not a cure for white innocence or white racism. The problem is that you imagine that all this is the case, and now I'm being put in the position of having to explain the difference. Even after this, I attempted for over a year to invite those in the organization's leadership together to educate ourselves through Black, Indigenous, people of color, scholars, artists, critics, articulations about why such projects are a problem. And they are part of the histories of imaging minoritized communities in a problematic way, and how an institution supporting such projects also becomes part of how structural inequalities are reproduced. I suggested that the organization initiate some thoughtful, responsive programming, inviting speakers for a series of conversations, for example, together with artists that address some of those most prevalent and pressing structural and systematic issues that are part of visual arts institutions. Why not take on a leadership role as an institution? That would bring so much accolades to the institution. But instead, I received polite and encouraging responses, but to all my attempts to actually make meaningful action rather than engage in empty behind the scenes boardroom talk, I was told that due to existing programs and exhibition schedules, we should speak at a later date. Trust me when I say some of these were eye-watering conversations, if not all of them, where I was the minoritized woman doing that unpaid labor of attempting to educate resisting, but well-meaning and very nice white interlocutors. During one informal conversation, I was told that I, quote, like to make us do more work. It was said jovially enough while the person was walking away. In response to my last email attempt, right before I was scheduled to have knee surgery earlier this year, I was told, quote, the staff are already stretched thin with existing workloads and programming with which the organization staff are burdened. This is very true. And what I proposed was not something that the organization had the ability to do as I envisioned it at this moment, but we could discuss it together. So it was, again, I feel, an invitation that I know in many ways it's just a conversation that takes up time, but no real action is taken. So for that reason, I stopped responding, or I just didn't engage anymore. It was asking me, an unpaid board member, to raise grant money with a whole other academic institution where I had no salary and no affiliation with their faculty. And so I was being asked to raise funds together with another university that supports this institution. And I couldn't imagine why such a request would be made of me. So the hell I was going to do that. So it pained me to realize that a fundamentally necessary conversations and actions were not happening at an institution I really respected and continue to respect. And no actions that should have happened 20 years ago were happening at this time. But these are imperative conversations and actions to take internally and publicly. After all, it is the public whom the institution also serves, who have come to listen and to a white Italian artist mumble through statements expressing his goodwill and desire to explore his ignorance about racism that had to deal with all of that. Given the wealth of work done by activists, artists writing about in the Black critical feminist and anti-colonial traditions, and dialogues widely available on the internet, there is no excuse for those in positions of leadership in any arts organization not to have educated themselves. Even the most conscientious and political and critical of us have to continually educate, reconverse, re-educate ourselves on how our blind spots and privileges affect the choices we make. That, of course, includes me. So when the day of the Italian artist talk rolled around, I purposefully arrived late, stood in the back, and it was kind of a shit show from back there because I heard all the audience's comments. I was embarrassed that the institution's leadership had not even publicly addressed the concerns. I clearly identified or invited the audience to address their concerns because they clearly had them. Instead, they asked another Black person to be in conversation with the artist as if the presence of that Black person was an antidote to the specter of their decision. After the event was over, I was asked why I didn't ask a pointed question. After all, they knew my questions. My answer was that it was their responsibility to invite and make the audience feel welcome enough to ask the questions that they rightfully had, not ask me to be that, haranguing Black person, that auntie who shouts at you and the artist in the middle of his talk. That's so rude, and it's also not labor that I want to do. And it doesn't lead to anything productive anyway. A responsible response from the institution, and not a whitewash, may have created a productive dialogue that may have allowed the local community who came in large numbers to express their unease and critique? I don't know. What I do know is that for a year, I received what can only be described as passive active resistance to identifying and correcting lacunae in the politics of institutional and aesthetic decisions. No matter how well I articulated and enumerated these concerns, there was polite pushback, avoidance, ceremonial support, and little in the way of practical responses towards organizing much needed dialogues and much needed action. It showed me that the work that the organization and its leadership needed to do, about which I was working exceedingly hard to bring attention to, did not seem to be a priority. For these reasons, I decided on a different course of action. I moved the dialogues I wanted to organize into more productive spaces and institutions where they would be welcomed and actively supported. And there's reasons for that. That was preferable to engaging in yet another cycle of talking that goes nowhere productive, or worse, burden me as a minoritized individual to do that uncompensated and psychologically and intellectually taxing labor of explaining and teaching without seeing any results. These dialogues, and the first of which we are part of, are the result of that realization. So thank you so much, and I want to welcome my fellow panelists to the conversation, and thank you for your patience in hearing me out. It's been 2 years of me holding some of that in. And I know that each of you have also experienced some of that, and that's the reason for it. So I think to start off, I want to ask each of you to maybe talk about what brought you to photography, and as a side question, you know, what got you thinking about the ways that institutions and those who are in positions of leadership in institutions, how they can create exclusions and erasures, but they can also invite and create new dialogues, because each of you are part of institutions and are in positions of leadership at institutions, and you have all done this work. So I want to kind of ask you about, you know, the way that you came to photography and how you encountered some of what we've been talking about, and what your experiences have been as well. And I'll just open up the conversation now.
Hi, everybody. So I'm not Aaron Turner. I'm Zora J. Murph. Yeah, thanks, Neelika, for sharing your story. And I think there, you know, like were points, you know, like where I was kind of like chuckling, and but I think, you know, I think I'm laughing because it's like, it's so recognizable, right? You know, the story that you tell. Like I've been there. I'm here right now. I'm in it right now, and so it's like, you know, it's like completely understand, you know, what you're saying and where you're coming from. There was a question in the chat. Was the photographer you were talking about this Niccolò Calzo, right?
Yes, I just didn't want to like,
Sure.
his name take up more space than he already
Yeah. Right, but I think it's like, yeah, there, you know, there, like that's like the specific example that you're talking about, but you know, that yeah, like that's not the only actor in this, right? And so I think my experiences, you know, in this is, you know, like I come to it as an artist, you know, as a student, as an educator, you know, like all of these experiences in academia that I've had, and then even just, you know, being a practicing artist out in the world. But for me, like seeing, you know, white supremacy in institutions, it actually, you know, I started to see that when I was working as a probation services worker, you know, like right when I first started studying photography. And, you know, like shortly after the, you know, the murder of Michael Brown, our supervisors pulled, you know, like all of my colleagues together to talk about, you know, like the discussions we should be having with the kids that we're working with, you know, because our job is to keep them from coming into additional contact with law enforcement. And so like, you know, but like looking at this moment, seeing these images on the news and, you know, like understanding that like these could be some of our kids. And so how do we talk with them about, you know, these encounters, you know, like how do we work through this? How do we make sure that you're prioritizing your own safety? And during that meeting, you know, a colleague said, he made a hands up, don't shoot joke. And like, I understood in that moment, I was like, well, I'm only going to work this job for as long as I need to. But also like, you know, just sort of a precursor, you know, a taste of like what it is that like we're truly up against. So not only do you have these institutions that were designed to benefit white supremacy, you have individual participants within those structures that continue to enable the system to function in the way that it does. And so I think that to me is like sort of my kind of insight, or like, you know, sort of how I decided to get into this work. And then also like how I continue to engage in these discussions through the work that I do.
Sama?
Hi, thanks Neelika for inviting me. It's so wonderful to be with everyone here today. I guess the question was the entry point, right, to photography. I started off with a desire to be a war photographer. As photojournalism is where I first studied, and I think as a Palestinian Iraqi, having lived my childhood in Iraq and across the Middle East, coming to the West was quite shocking, and seeing the kind of images and how the characterization of Arabs was displayed across magazines and newspapers. And so I had a very naive idea that somehow that I could change that. And immediately I realized that was not really the direction I wanted to move in, and that would, you know, there would be so many problems with that within itself. And that by being an artist and doing my own work, I would have more control and agency with the image. But it's still my work is still very related to the way these representations and depictions and the challenging that starts really at the inception of photography and the rise of photography with the rise of imperialism and the legacy of post-colonialism on today, the kind of images you see today, especially factoring in gender and war and post-war. So, and obviously all the kind of conflations that go with representations of women being veiled or pious, being some sort of a justification for terror wars, right? Forever wars on the behalf of the United States. So these are my main entry points. But as an academic, professor, and an artist, an educator, I too have been, I felt, I was literally laughing out loud because I felt you were describing scenarios that had taken place here and around, both for me as an artist, in exhibitions and in moments where I was being gifted opportunity and a platform, and being told in a very tokenized way that this is an opportunity that you get to have. And so don't challenge it, don't speak out against the problems of what we're doing. And there's been a lot of career threat, all the ways to institutions that I work very closely with as an academic and as an educator in service of student and community audiences. And I've tried to challenge what they call American photography, and who that is and who it belongs to and where it's going. And especially on the subject of legacy, the threat to the canon, the threat to the history, the threat to the photographers. This has been my main interest, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years, to challenge. We're not just trying to add seats to the table, which I think is important, but to challenge those who occupy seats and the work and the damage that work has done and is doing. Thank you.
Andrew, I want you to join in at this point, and then Aaron as well. By the way, that's Andrew, not Sama Al-Shabi. We had some tech difficulties and we signed in on each other's links. Go ahead, Andrew.
I think very much like what Sama said, you know, and I started my career at this kind of burning desire to be a photojournalist, to be a war photographer, to go around the world and to tell stories. But also at the same time, you know, looking at how people who look like me were reflected in the British media, you know, I never saw myself represented in the ways in which I knew myself to exist. And I thought naively as well, as Sama said, that I could go into this profession and I could help to, you know, address those negative kind of perceptions and images. But then quickly you find out that your job really is to center whiteness in all of its shape-shifting and nuanced and different ways. You know, so you get editorial portraits to do features of the, you know, successful white multimillionaire car designer, then the white Booker Prize winning writer, and then it would be a range of identities of whiteness, and then you'd have the war widow, you'd have all of these different kind of stories. And then the two jobs which I get for Black people, one is a looter and one is a singer. And you kind of quickly realize that, you know, I'm becoming part of the problem as such. I'm creating these representations which just affirm known perceptions of how people see the world. And I remember one time pitching a story to one of these British national publications, and it was a story about my parents' migration from Jamaica to the UK and the legacies of that migration. And I was told by the picture editor, oh, these are beautiful images, but our audience wouldn't like these images. And I'm thinking, your audience, you know, I'm an audience, I read this newspaper. Who is this audience that you are so attuned to in that sense? But I think, you know, within the global north, you know, the role of photography is to center whiteness. Historically, from, you know, the colonial project, the camera and the photograph is being used to, I guess, map terrain, but also to subjugate and to create classifications of individuals. And it's always by othering individuals, you put whiteness at the center of that. And it's difficult to look at contemporary photojournalism and not say that's the same thing. You know, if you're continually showing Black bodies in crisis and in chaos, and always, you know, as othered kind of entities, you can think about why would a picture editor think that a Black person is the right person for that job, I guess. What I kind of found that when I didn't have, and I don't have any kind of proof of this, ongoing the fact that when I began to put my picture of myself onto my website, those kind of commissions kind of decreased in one sense. And because, you know, in the UK, my name is Andrew Jackson, as opposed to what the Zoom thing says there, there's a perception perhaps of who I am and how an editorial commission works, that look, who is the closest person to this regionally for this job, and they think, well, maybe this is a suitable candidate for that job. And I guess there is going through the idea of the institution, you are told basically what is good photography, what is bad photography. And in the main, good photography is made by white heterosexual men in one sense. And there's a perception of who is able to tell stories and who isn't. And I think that perhaps in one sense, there's a limitation of what a Black photographer can do as opposed to what a white photographer can do. But maybe I'm going off at a tangent.
No. Thank you for that. And so, Aaron, I wanted to just jump in and talk about how you got interested in photography and what your own experiences have been. Since also you run a center now, you've initiated that center. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I came to photography sort of like Sama was saying, first purely from a journalism standpoint, you know, being interested in telling stories through photography, community storytelling. And, you know, when I was studying it, I found myself in this hybrid situation of taking photography classes in the art department and then reporting classes in the journalism department. And it was this totally like separate experience. And it wasn't until I went to grad school at Ohio University and studied visual communications and really started to get in what representation and photojournalism was. I began to realize that, people who looked like me were in the photographs, but people who looked like me who take photographs were out of the narrative in terms of photo history. And that was sort of like my catalyst and interested in like that historical component, like who's making the images and what images am I making that will be a part of history later on. And so I started really connecting the dots. And then through exposure to other artists, I began to understand that I could document my own family story regionally and personally in terms of being from the Arkansas Delta. But I only came to that realization by being exposed to other photographers who didn't look like me, who were literally photographing in these towns. When I read the caption, these are towns that I grew up in, walked around in, family exists in, had all types of experiences in. So I wanted to take my skill set as a photographer and tell that story from an insider's perspective. And what really got me interested in what I do now in terms of the Center for Photographers of Color is really understanding the lack of representation in photo history. I mean, when I come across a book called Reflections in Black from Dr. Deborah Willis, an artist and scholar, my first question is, why is this whole narrative separate from all this other stuff that we've been presented within institutions? And that exists for several other diasporas as well, in terms of representation being present and having to sort of, what it really is people taking initiative and assigning value to things they deem valuable themselves. So for Dr. Deborah Willis to produce that book, that's assigning value to those photographers and to those photographs, which did not have any inherent value from the perspective of these major institutions and publications that will leave those voices out. So, and then, recently I was talking to a class at another institution, and a student asked me, do you believe institutions can be equitable? And my definitive answer to that is really no. I don't think institutions can be equitable. It's about the people who work at those institutions and those people, as you were saying, Neelika, paying attention, doing the work to sort of figure out what is missing from these narratives. And until that starts to happen, inherently no institution can be equitable, in my opinion. And that's why I created the Center for Photographers of Color, again, to assign value to things that these major institutions ignore.
Thank you. So I want to ask many of the people who are joining in, our students, and Zora, you talked about this a bit. As students, nearly all of us experience some sort of dodgy professor or critique of our work. If we went to institutions with predominantly white instructors and fellow students, we might have had some really amazing institutional support through our professors. I think Sama really did have an amazing cohort of professors who supported her. But many of us had a very different kind of experience. And Zora, you talked about this, and so I wanted to ask you particularly, how might some of these marginalizing experiences teach us to, in fact, recognize and engage with and break down institutional languages and practices, and then we have to carry it forward and do the same, and for our white students as well as for our minoritized students, because I think, our students all of them need to have the same kind of that language and the courage to speak it.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like it's, it's also important to acknowledge that like we all have biases, right? And so to me, it's understanding like how those get enacted, and sort of in my experience, it's always very swift. It's just like you're going about your day, you're You're doing, you know, what you do, you know, you take your smoke break between class. Aaron knows about this one. Well, he doesn't smoke, but like, you know, taking a smoke break, and it's like every white person you encounter, like automatically assuming you're a student, right? And it just happens so quickly. And it's like, oh yeah, that's right. Black professors don't exist. I forgot. Sorry. I apologize. You know, and so it's like, I think it's understanding like how swiftly they happen, like how many times they happen on a daily basis. And so understanding, I think for me, like very young, like, you know, kind of in this experience, like when I first, you know, decided to go back to school for art, like understanding that like it wasn't a space again that was crafted for me, you know, learning, you know, like about only learning about photography through, you know, being shown white artists. But then, you know, often like walking away from situations, like not necessarily being able to explain what I was feeling, just that I felt it, right? And it made me feel bad. And that's like really what I could understand. And so it was all like, I think, you know, from the time I was an undergrad, you know, through grad school, I learned how to sort of break those feelings down in real time, and then be able to sort of start to deliver critique to those things when they happen, and like call them out and like make people engage in discussion about them. And so, you know, like as a graduate student, like one of the largest struggles that I had was, you know, professors challenging, you know, my work being about Blackness. And it would happen in, different ways. You know, it would happen where they, you know, like the questions like seemed to be like trying to figure out if I was just using Blackness as a ploy to make work because I didn't have any other ideas, or that it was like a way for me to make my work inaccessible to them. Or as like this sort of like this kind of like God, like I think I'm kind of lost for words right now and trying to describe it, but like I think it was like, oh, like trying to basically like provide me an out, like I needed an out or something, like you know, you don't have to make work about this if you don't want to. And I'm like, well, that's not really an option for me, because we live in a world that's going to acknowledge this difference that will be my experience throughout my life, that's fundamentally not going to change, you know, during the span of my life, right? So there's that, right? But then also, like I think the moment for me was like it was really kind of coincidence, but I had read about double consciousness. Like that was the first time I had heard about double consciousness. And then soon after, like, you know, being in sort of this, like, you know, kind of heated critique, and then being like, oh, wait, that's right. You're asking me that. You don't see the problem because you're white. No one ever asks you, well, are you only making this work because you're white? Like they've never been asked that question, right? And so now, but it was like, it wasn't until that moment that I possessed the language to be able to articulate that and give that back to them for them to unpack. Because what I was being put through wasn't my problem, it was their problem. And so, you know, I think walking away from that experience and into being an educator, you know, I expected it to be no different. But I feel like one of the things that I've seen and that makes me hopeful is that, like, you know, at the University of Arkansas, we recently had students who, you know, like started an initiative called Burn It Down, but it was to basically will the institution to address matters when it comes to accountability, responsibility, and transparency. And so how do we as faculty, how do we respond to, you know, these requests for changes? And to me, it's like seeing, like being called out in that way is important. And then, you know, like going past that is trying to figure out, what does this look like on a day-to-day basis? You know, like what are the things that we need to change to give people more access to information? You know, to make sure that we're actually building an environment that honors the principles that we espouse, right? And so, you know, like it's a struggle. It's, you know, it's always going to be a struggle. but the level of conversation that I'm engaged in with my students as a faculty member right now, I could have never imagined doing that when I was a graduate student, you know, like just 3 years ago, right? You know, and so, yeah, I guess I'll just kind of leave it there.
Thanks, Laura. I also think in a related way, some things that Sama spoke about or wrote about is the fact that, you know, like we're often asked when things happen, why didn't you speak up? But there is a lot of how would you call it? Like a loss that you will experience as a minoritized artist or writer or person if you speak up. So that's why you don't. And also, like, nothing happens just because you speak up. So it's energy loss, but you will also get, you know, there will be punitive measures against your career, or just, you know, like in personal ways, so that it just adds a strain to you. And so I was going to ask Sama to speak a little bit about it, because she, you know, she spoke about that a little bit at her introduction, but there's a lot more that each of you have experienced, and maybe others can jump in too.
Yeah, thank you. I guess. It's interesting. This morning, I got up really early, and I just sat down, and I don't know why I did this to myself, but I just started listing every single thing that came to mind. And as Zora is saying, really, these things are swift. They happen all the time. And but obviously some of them are experiences that really are like seared into my memory, because how much I tried to resist it. Nobody would ever accuse me of being a shrinking wallflower. If I have an opinion, I will say it. Even if there is risk, I can't stop it. But of course, I'm an academic, and I try to do things in a diplomatic way. My point is not to necessarily, I don't want to necessarily challenge just to challenge. I want to be proactive. I want change, right? And so, although, you know, I also think I'm a bit naive there too. Anyway. As an artist, definitely the largest, so I don't know, I could almost say that when you are challenging the hierarchy, if you're challenging the system, if you're challenging the curator, the gatekeeper, the director on practices that are exclusionary or bigoted or racist, assumptions that are being made that are wholly inappropriate and very exclusionary, you'll have to suffer the consequences. And so it could be as trivial, but still feels very traumatic and violent to have someone read you their institution's mission statement and diversity statement to you, right? When you're actually like done the labor to outline all the problems and even provide solutions. Or to what it's sort of like just trying to turn the tables and make you the problem. You're the careerist that is obsessed with your own self-promotion. You want to provide more opportunities for yourself and take them away from another artist, another white, deserving, I'm not even using the word white, but they're saying it's somebody else when you're talking about exclusion. Use the word censorship. What I get thrown at a lot is that I am engaging in erasure of history, erasure of the canon, erasure of the legacies, tarnishing the legacies of white photographers and challenging their centrality to the canon and to importance. And so, you know, it can be very specific to images made by photographers in very important historical periods like the civil rights era, right? And the institution gatekeeper director will be like, who can deny that what's contained in this work is so important, right? These are pivotal, important, significant moments of history, but who got to photograph them? Who was assigned to photograph them, right? Which communities, in what ways? And I understand that photographs are documents and they contain very important information of history. And I'm not trying to erase that history, but there are also other kinds of photographers, well documented by great historians. The work of Deb Willis comes to mind, of course, but there are many others that have parallels, and photographs that are not being collected and put out as the most central images that we should look at this history for. So that critique comes to me a lot when I'm challenging it, being called a careerist, calling that I'm trying to self-advance, an erasure of other people's experiences, deflecting blame. And I've also, like you, Neelika, have been asked, well, if you have a problem with it, come to the said artist talk or whatever the program is and challenge it. That's what the Q&A is for, right? And so stand in an audience and be that voice, be that person that, and especially when you have relationships with these institutions, or they might be affiliated with your places of employment, right? Or places that might have granted you money before. Now you are not only threatening your sort of personal or artistic career, you're threatening your livelihood, right? And I really ask, do they really want me to do that? Do you want me to sit in an audience, raise my hand, and dismantle your guest and your question, and have all the students and audience and community member clearly see the issues that you're engaged in? Or wouldn't it be better to kind of rethink these programs and rethink these questions and think about your collection, your program as an open practice, one that's worthy of interrogation and ideas and multiple viewpoints and overlapping histories. And I was just going to say, I'm going to cede my time here in a minute, but I'm going to say, I actually, I think one of the greatest strengths that I had is that I went to programs that had faculty of color. I was at Columbia College. It's funny, like how Columbia College back in the 90s is so much more advanced than a lot of the universities of today. I mean, I studied under John H. White. So Black photography and photojournalism was centered around Gordon Parks. I had Chester Wiggins too. Stephen Mark was my professor. Now he's at ASU, but at that time he was, and his history was being a street photographer in Chicago at that period. And then at graduate school, Albert Chong, so all Black photographers, as I'm mentioning, Albert Chong, and then some other professors too from Philippines and from Argentina. So I did have strong white faculty, but my center core mentorship came from faculty of color. So it completely made me understand how pivotal that role would be as I entered academia. And for the bulk of the time that I've worked at my institution, I have been one of 2 artists of color professors. We've made some great inroads in the last few years and have changed the dynamic. So finally, I have a faculty to sit with me as we approach the College of Fine Arts, as we approach the museum spaces, as we start challenging the curriculum as a colonialist, racist curriculum. But that's very hard to do as one person. Although I did try, it was very easy to dismiss me because I was one person.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is an ongoing issue. And I think, Zora, you wanted to address, and actually everybody, I was wondering about also working as a commercial photographer, Andrew, and what that's like. And you mentioned growing up in Britain, how you looked at, the US as something, a place where there was a little bit more respect.
Probably naively, I guess, but it's also numbers, I guess. Or, I came from a part of England which was a kind of industrial town where there wasn't a large Black population in that sense. And so, you go to your local kind of university and, I was the only Black person in that class. And you even now in, kind of UK institutions, you rarely see members of Black staff. I was never taught by a Black teacher. I've only ever worked with one Black curator, one Black picture editor. And so there's always this kind of distance and loneliness within that. And there's this fear of speaking up because, hey, if you speak up, you can turn around, nobody's got your back in this conversation, you're done. Especially working in kind of editorial commissions, well, they just use somebody else if you speak up and say, well, I think this is wrong, or I guess whatever. But so, yeah, there is this kind of isolation. I just want to go back quickly to something which Zora said about, working in the institution. And there is this kind of ingrained perception about who you are and what your position is within this space. And the same thing, I've taught in places, and you go into the staff room and you're quickly told, excuse me, this is for lecturers only. Students aren't meant to be in here. You're using the staff photocopier, but you've got your staff ID on, and you're told, excuse me, this is for staff. And I'm not even saying that, the people who are doing this are out and out racist, but there is a perception of where you are in the hierarchy of things. There's a perception of your abilities, So and even before you've opened your mouth, there's a perception of people know who you are, where you come from, what your background is, where you live, what you do. So it's how do you fight across that, I guess. And as I kind of said earlier, there is a perception of you as the Black photographer, what your role is, what you're supposed to be doing, who you can, what stories you can tell. And I think when I went to university, and again, as mentioned, there's only Black students in the class, and strangely, maybe conversely to everybody else, I kind of reacted to what I was told I should be doing. So the teacher was, the lecturer was saying, maybe you should explore your Black identity. And part of me felt, well, I didn't need to explain anything to you about my Black identity. Why did I need to tell you anything about, So I also wanted this idea, I wanted to do all the other stories like everybody else in the class. And it's not until I kind of got older and started to realize, well, if I'm not telling my stories, then somebody else is going to tell them for me. Again, in ways in which I don't perceive them to exist. And they all get the exhibitions, they'll get the shows, they'll get the whatever, because, the white photography is always a credible source. My experience always needs to be filtered through a white experience in that sense. I need a white experience to validate what is real in terms of what I'm saying. So it's, I guess, why I looked at America when I was younger. I could see a Black general, I could see a Black congressman, I could see the Black film star making a living. And I know those are limited numbers, I guess, but when you're coming from a space where you don't see any of that whatsoever, that becomes appealing, maybe in a fantastical kind of way. And it's not until you look at the realities of, I guess, living in North America, living in Canada, the realities of the fact that, cops have guns here too. There are questions about, are you supposed to be in this middle-class white space? And so there's always these transactions and negotiations. What I found interesting moving from the UK to coming to Canada is that in the UK, I thought that I had all these things worked out. And I kind of thought that I knew the dynamics of race within the UK, and I knew, even in terms of spaces, physical spaces, where it's okay for me to go, where it's not okay for me to go. And suddenly coming to Montreal, say in England, I could see another Black man of my age. He wouldn't know me from Adam, but I could look at him, I could nod my head, and I know we have the same shared commonality in that sense. Suddenly I'm in a space like Montreal, where, Blackness is also now divided through Anglophone and Francophone. And the Black Francophone might have more in common with the white Francophone than with the Black Anglophone. So there's all these now strange kind of intersections which I'm trying to negotiate and make sense of being out here. But I think England, the UK, especially with this kind of shift towards the right, there's now an attempt in England to, I guess, reinvent England or Britain as a white space. Leaving Europe, Brexit, reclaiming their identity and their own laws and so forth. Britain, just like America, is a difficult space to navigate, I guess. And again, I think I might have gone up at a tangent.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I want to just say, okay, we're reaching the point of 1:30 and now, and I just want to pose one last question to Aaron, or ask him to talk about some experiences that we discussed earlier, and then we'll go to question and answer. Aaron, you had talked to and written about how the ethics of our practice as photographers is really important to have embedded into our curricula and into our curatorial practices, jury processes, and to understand that there is an ethics in your work. Just because you're a Black photographer or a minoritized artist does not mean that you automatically know, because I think, in fact, one of the questions sent to me ahead of time from somebody like actually in India was that all of us live with white supremacist images, so we often reproduce those same aesthetics because we've learned that this is how one should see the world, and that's how we were taught as well. So you mentioned a few things in our kind of email exchange, so I wanted you to address that.
Yeah, thank you. And I had to switch to my phone because my laptop's about to die. So glad to still be in the conversation and didn't have to miss any time. But yeah, I'm thinking about, and I'm looking at some notes here that I've made. Yeah, you have to keep in mind like who makes images and who is being photographed, and where will the images end up, and who are those images speaking to, kind of what Andrew was speaking about as well. And this all affects, you know, the people being portrayed in the images. It affects their humanity. You as the photographer, you know, we play a role in the depiction of those folks' humanity. And then, you know, we play a vital role in image making and depiction in society in general. So that's a huge responsibility. And one of the examples that I was looking at here is thinking about Kira Mae Weems's family pictures and folktale stories, thinking about Weems's position as an African-American woman whose voice is denied access and representation. And that still is the general theme for African-American women in photography today. And so within that work, you know, questions about assumed objectivity of what documentary photography can do, and its ability to do social change, and sort of taking the stance of like, you know, it's not really an unquestioned process of representing. Think about how existence of certain institutions, what the existence of those institutions, how they perpetuate social stereotypes, and the position of the subjects in the photographs. And so I think, you know, as photographers and artists more so, we had a potential of both to be subject and artist in the work. And so again, that's like sort of like a 360 way around to say that who's making the images, why are we making the images, and where will they end up? And so that's sort of what I was thinking about there. I was also thinking about like, in terms of ethics, I remember being a grad student at Ohio University, and there was just, you know, the typical line you would tote was like, you apply to these competitions, you win awards, you go get an internship, you get a story that goes viral, ... You know, you cover all your bases, and then you're sort of recognized for what you do in the field, but not necessarily who you depict in the photographs. Some of the scandals I remember in Ohio University was more so like photo manipulation. And then we sort of evolve into predatorial photo editors. And then now, we're directly talking about institutions and photographers and the depictions of folks and images, and then how those images are being disseminated. So this thing of ethics just keeps evolving. It keeps getting more dense and dense. And I think the reason that is because people have not stopped to ask those three questions. Who am I as a person holding the camera? And where will these images end up? And why am I making these images? And how will that, how does that tie in or intersect with social and political apparatuses or themes? And that was a little all over the place, but I hope that made sense.
Thank you so much. That's great. We've had like an amazing discussion. Thank you so much. I hope people aren't demoralized. After all, we're doing our work. Depression, no. It's, no. Do not go into pandemic depression in addition to this depression right now, because of, we're just outing some of the things that we are usually not allowed to speak about, because either you're just like the weirdo who just doesn't like that photographer, not that you're pointing out an institutional and systemic problem, or you're the complainer and why aren't you just grateful for this position, or you're just making us do work, so you don't, I think that this is a really important avenue. It's because we rarely get to have this kind of supportive conversation, and there's going to be literally hundreds of other minoritized people who have these experiences and wondering what to do. So I'm really grateful for this honesty and the frankness with which we've had this discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy to ask the questions that panel people who've been listening in have asked. So over to you, Amy.
Sure. So we got a question from Nidirta. What you said sounds a lot like what Condé Nast is doing, but Condé Nast is much more extreme in the sense that they aren't paying their POC creators for being part of videos and such, or giving them credit. And when they tried to bring this to their attention and why it was a problem, they didn't really do much to address or solve it. So yes, this was quite a public falling out at Condé Nast that has happened over the past few months. More of a comment than a question.
Anyone?
I'll add to that. There's also, in the wake of this summer and some of the challenges we're having with representation and thoughts that who gets represented, the questions that are kind of coming up in the performative George Floyd comments that came from institutions, magazines, newspapers, businesses, has sparked debate, right? And so the same thing is happening with publications that like Vogue or Harper's Bazaar, which have, I don't know if they have ones for countries in Africa, but they have one for the Middle East. It's called like Vogue Arabia or Harper's Arabia. And there's a lot of backlash starting to happen because they employ primarily white Western photographers and crews, and the covers are all of European American actresses and models, right? It's very rare. I think there's been one cover in the last 15 years. It's very, very rare. But then again, it goes back to what Neelika has just said. It's like, even if these practices were changed and you started hiring artists that are from the Middle East and North Africa to work on such productions, and even you'd have an actress or a model that's from that part of the world, all the notions of beauty get captured with this notions of colonialism, the whole capitalism marketplace, right? The sort of violence that's inherited in all of that. So what do these, it feels, I mean, obviously that's a step, but I don't know if it challenges what those magazines represent and what they center, like what's important to them. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, and I think that even is it Simone Biles who was photographed by with such poor lighting, and so you had to be like grateful that Simone Biles was like in Vogue and that there was a feature because oh yay, finally a Black woman, but the lighting made her look very ashen and very dull-skinned. And so many Black photographers were on Twitter saying, you know what, all I have to do is like, this is like a 2-second adjustment. And she would have looked vibrant. And here's what I did. Like, this literally took me 2 seconds to do. And why didn't, you know, fancy famous photographer who you hire all the time, and again, I don't want to foreground their names, but, you know, why didn't you hire a Black person who knows how to photograph people with darker skin, and beautifully so? So, you know, you might get this representation, but each of us have talked about the fact that it's not about putting a number in, and that diversity, Aaron, you know, that quote that you said, that diversity isn't the goal, because diversity is a corporate goal. It's not a goal for us. You want justice, not diversity. I think, you know, that was something that was really important that you said. So Amy, other questions?
We have another question or comment from Vasudha, who says, I've often struggled with critique sessions at my art school because most often I wasn't clear if the feedback I was getting was contextual to the framework from within which my work existed, or a white perspective that couldn't accept the work as it was.
Anyone?
I'm sorry, Amy, can you repeat that one again? I'm sorry.
Sure. The question says, or the comment says, I struggled with critique sessions at my art school because most often I wasn't clear if the feedback I was getting was contextual to the framework within which my work existed, or if it was coming from a white perspective that couldn't accept the work as it was. So speaking to a kind of legibility problems around, perceived problems around legibility.
Yeah, that's a deep question. You can come at it from so many different perspectives, you know, even from my own experiences. And even now I'm thinking about the work I do and why I use abstraction versus a formal portrait approach to work now. But there's going to be these instances, you know, especially for the students out there, where the educators are going to be putting, and they shouldn't be, but putting the labor on you to really explain your Blackness or your otherness. And in that way, they are othering you. And so within that space, what you have to do is, you know, what I like to do is like to read about other artists and what other artists have said about these things, because often you can get the proper perspective from them. But the route that I would go is, you know, be ready to flip the questions back onto them. You know, they're othering you. Let's flip the question back on them in the institutions and really critique why are they coming at it from that perspective, and really be forthright with what it is that you're trying to do with your work. That's my advice on that.
Yeah. Other questions, Amy?
Sure. There was a question from Susanna. David Zwirner has just created an all-Black staff gallery in New York. Is that a good approach? Question mark.
Yeah, I don't, that's like a, oh, go ahead, Neelika, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, yeah, like I think to me, like I like seeing like the conversations that are happening, you know, the movement that is happening. But I feel like to me, like I'm still kind of grappling with the underlying question of like how, in my experience, you know, Blackness, but I think if we think more broadly, you know, like identity, like how it's used, like how it seems to be inextricable from commodity. And so, I mean, I think that like I sort of grapple, I kind of grapple with that. And I think it relates back to this idea of labor, like who does the work, who does the labor in these moments. You know, because like I've been asked to do a lot of different things, you know, since, especially since the murder of George Floyd. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's like, you know, a good model or the answer. I think it's great, you know, like, you know, Black people got some great jobs. But I think I'm more interested in like, I don't know if it's necessarily maybe about seeking a perfect model, but when we ask these questions and, you know, we get past discussion into action, I think we need to begin questioning those actions and what those actions lead to. You know, I think there's, I just read this really great article from 1976 about like this idea of a conception of like a new concept of citizenship, and the author talks about this idea of technology. We try to solve problems with technology, but often what we don't do is think about how our values based in like how our values embedded into that technology, because we always seem to see it as value free. But it's never value free, whether it's like, you know, like technology, or whether it's social technology. You know, if we're thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion as forms of social technology, you know, we have to question like, where are the values in it, and how are those values enacted on a daily basis and actually like show up in the community. Yeah.
I think related to that is the question of Shane's asked about instead of like, I think it's always important after we have these conversations to, you know, discuss what our generative pathways are, because I think we can speak about the problems because it's important to speak about them because we're silenced so much. So that in itself is a very much an important political act to take. So I'm not decrying the fact that we should have these conversations very openly, because there are very few places where we can talk like this without being, you know, receiving some kind of punitive response. But as far as those generative pathways go, I think, first of all, the fact that you have to create generative pathways comes from the fact that there is institutional pushback. And so it comes from censorship, or comes from silencing, it comes from violence. And that's why you're having to do that with very few resources. You know, the kind of work I had to do to just get this conversation together, and amazingly finding colleagues at VIAD who put together this program, that was a miracle. I didn't know that, you know, if it would ever happen, but I was gonna damn well try. This is a generative pathway, because this in itself, a place in which we actually speak, is a generative moment. And it gives, if I had some of these conversations happening when I was a student, it would have been amazing. And to, you know, if I had had faculty or colleagues who would have had these conversations with me, it would have been amazing. But I think it's important to kind of also talk about what are the generative pathways. And I don't think that Sverna creating a, you don't know, some kind of Black employment model is a generative pathway. As you know, I think that one of the things we talked about is the fact that, or you know, like there's a particular gallery, I won't even name, that always has very kind of Black photographers or Black artists who create very sort of, you know, the exoticized work that, of course, their patrons get by, and it's a very well-funded, well-to-do gallery in the, you know, richest part of Chelsea. So that isn't just because that person has a slew of Black artists does not mean that's a generative model or a pathway. So I think in many ways, I think that each of us are doing generative things because that's why, you know, we're together and we're talking even. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been in conversation. We're just trying to create that generative pathway for many others who are going to be part of the audience now or later. And that's why we can record this, because I think it's very important to have this as a generative pathway later for those who couldn't be here, and that an educator can use, that anybody can use.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's, you know, like how maybe rather than like searching for an ideal model, it's like, I think it's considering those times that people have tried to start these discussions. Mm-hmm. What ways have you decided, right? You as the person in power, the institution, how have you decided to just ignore it? How do you change that response, right? Benevolence obviously isn't the answer. That's what you always try to do. I'm gonna roll my eyes real fucking hard. Tired of the benevolent attitudes. Sick of it, over it, done. We need to get past it. But also in that, like, defensiveness doesn't breed compassion. So how do you get past defensiveness? If we can, I mean, we can no longer sit here and say that white supremacy doesn't exist in any institution, right? That's like non-negotiable anymore, right? But when, like, whenever that has come, the response has always been defensive. And in that response, there is never compassion. And so to me, that like is maybe a way of trying to figure out how you change the model of yourself to change the model of the institution that you work in.
I also would say, like, not for the institution, not to rush to self-congratulate themselves on actions or programming they may have done because of such discussions. You can't band-aid your way out of systemic racism inside the institution. You can't pick it like a smorgasbord. You're gonna get your little cherries and that's the one I like, that one doesn't bother me. You know, this is a very difficult long-term work. And if you can imagine all of these people sitting here, this is not the field they went into, dismantling systemic racism in art institutions, right? I mean, this is not, and so this work is being done for free and over time. And if you're cherry picking and band-aiding and self-congratulating, you're part of a bigger problem than actually just your silence, okay? Because you're sort of signaling that you have figured this out, right? It's also not great to just say, figure it out for me. And I understand the motivation because you won't want to get it wrong. And you definitely don't want to get it wrong in a public space. But you know what Zora just spoke about, that kind of compassion and empathy, you know, go back to all those discussions you've had. Go back to all those emails you've received. Start with thinking about, you know, what kind of clear policies and processes and professional development and re-education, and you know, what's got to go, what's got to come, and think about this in a much longer way, and find a system to be accountable to yourself, so that you're not just working when it's on trend. You know, that when you get busy again, and when something else gets distracting happens again, this hasn't just fallen down, because that's one of the biggest critiques I have right now. You know, the institutions that I've tried to stay engaged with this conversation with, some of them are over 15 years, these dialogues, okay? And it's still, no matter what the labor and work and effort, and here's a blueprint, here's progressive ideas, here's proactive strategies, here's things that works within your mission, within your collection, within your things that you can do now. Here's the low-hanging fruit. You're still getting, I chose line 4B. That's the one, right? That isn't it. That ain't it.
I think it's kind of interesting about, you know, you talk about putting the Band-Aid onto things, and in a time of limited resources, for these institutions to have real inclusivity, somebody at the table is going to have to leave, and that's not going to happen in reality. So we carry on in the circle of having the Band-Aid put on and having to pull it off and put it back on again. And we have this panel talking about inclusivity and the problems facing the, you know, marginalized artists and reality. Everybody knows what the real problems are. Everybody knows what the real issues are, you know, but if people are talking about change, if change is going to happen, It would have happened a long time ago.
Yeah, Andrew, to continue off of that, coming into this talk, I was thinking about yourself, Zora and Sama, and how I've all interviewed all of you for the Photographers of Color podcast, and had extensive conversations with you all about this, and work in particular and how it operates in this larger art world, photo land narrative, and the things that you're trying to get done as artists. And the thing I'm trying to get done as an artist by interviewing you and asking you about your practices, that's the type of labor and work that I think that has to be done. And, the best way to address these institutional problems, and this goes back to empathy and perspective as well, is to bring in the artists who are making work directly about those things. There's so many artists and photographers and just people in general dealing with all these situations that we're talking about. I think the best way is to target and figure out who those artists are, bring them in, give them the resources that they need, and then start the conversations. Because if we continue to if institutions continue to overlook those artists and don't allow them to come into their institutions and allow a new conversation to be started, then we really get nowhere. And I'm not sure about the new David Swarner all Black gallery. I don't know if I want to get into that conversation, but because one perspective was that it was, it's not going to do anything really. And then other perspectives that I've seen on social media were praising it. So I don't really know where I stand on that. But it's kind of complicated because thinking about artists and their positions in relationships to galleries and the vulnerability that comes with that, and how they're valued in their time and everything like that. That's a more deeper conversation, but I am thinking about that.
The donor economy. I mean, that is the sort of unsaid thing in all of this. The justification and policing that happens of difficult conversations, very necessary conversations, the inclusion of artists that might challenge the very hand that feeds them, right, or the very hand that shows them, is often tied to the donor economy that somehow is setting it's like a shadow thing that's setting an agenda behind it. And I don't know to what degree, and I've been on some boards, but to what degree, how much of this is an excuse or how much of it is a challenge. But I know I can count on hands, fingers, toes of all the time that my Palestinian work, right, which talks about the self-determination of Palestine through my art, has been censored. And it's always the donors, right? Well, it's the donors, it's a threat to the donors, or this is the problem. We're cool with this stuff. This stuff is not serving your cause, right? And so I have really, I've definitely am very happy for the spaces that I've worked with that have given me full access to do whatever I want and no challenge. Lightwork is one of them. I see Jeffrey Hoons is here. Nueva Luz, right, and Foco. But these are very small handfuls, especially in the United States. I've had a lot more flexibility, actually, to tell you the truth, in Europe than I had here when it comes to Palestine. But this subject of donor economy is somehow tied to institutions and museums, and it can't be like lost in all of this.
There's just I think there's time for 2 more questions. We have a question from Ingrid, who says, in my view, much of the conversation has focused on power and in relation to racism. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about how power plays out within the Black community, and especially between the North and the South, on an individual and institutional level.
Do you mean the global North and global South?
North and South are in quotes.
Okay. Because North and South mean very different things. I guess to Americans, you like when we say South, like in an African context, right? So
I'm assuming this is global.
Okay. So what do you all think?
I mean, I guess like to the question, and yeah, I think, yeah, it's like important to make that like sort of distinction, Neelika, because I guess I read it as like my own experience as, you know, a Black person in America. And so, yeah, North and South to me mean like, you know, the American North, the American South. And so, and like, I think within the Black community, I guess like, again, like I feel like, well, I guess maybe the way that I approach it is like, and this is actually something I had to kind of pick apart with my students in a class I taught over the summer, but it's understanding that, like, I guess I approach things like sort of with thinking about intersectionality, you know, like how do these things intersect? So, you know, like often when I'm talking about racism, you know, I can be simultaneously talking about misogyny, right? Like, I mean, it's like, to me, it's like, you know, you can relate experiences based on, you know, what identities you may hold or like prescribe to, or, you know, like that society projects onto you. And so like, I would say like, you know, in my line of research, thinking about, you know, police violence in America, you know, how the conversation, like even, you know, like related to spectacle lynching in America, you know, it's always been centered on Black men. And so we often think about this moment, you know, like what's happening as like, we're fighting for the liberation of Black men. And so like within that, like, I think it's understanding that particular dynamic, and then how that exclusion, like how it works, and then like what it perpetuates. You know, like, yeah, I think it's, I don't know if there's like, if I really want to talk about like any sort of particular distinctions, but I think it to me, it's like, I'm trying to figure out like how we have like that broader discussion, because like that discussion is equally as important, and is, you know, like to me, a pathway to liberation of all oppressed people. I don't know. Yeah. So I think that's like how I'd answer that question.
One final question, Amy.
So many. Yeah, lots of people sending in questions. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to select one. A question from Candace. Tina Kampt recently said something important. She said that we have to move from empathy to implication. Right now, institutions are running to redress, but in the institutional statements floating around currently, there's little articulation about how they've been part of the problem and fronting on how they are addressing the need for diversity and inclusion. What kind of institutional practices should be happening around the recognition of complicity? And does institutional redress even mean an admission of complicity?
Yeah. I think it's important to address, because institutions, and as somebody said, behind these institutions are individuals, not even behind, but in front of those institutions are people who are so often, at times, very powerful, that they are institutions of their own, that you don't cross them, you know, like individuals like Martin Parr is an institution, and those who are in positions of leadership at these institutions make those decisions. And just because you give out, say, a residency or an exhibition or a, you know, whatever, speaking engagement, does not mean that this implication conversation that Candice is bringing up should not be happening, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation to begin with. Each of the panelists here have had a slew of residencies, a slew of exhibitions. It's not just the one, but yet, just because they've been excellent, amazing careers, or they've had excellent, amazing careers to continue, does not mean that they haven't encountered these things in the very institutions that have, quote, given them, like, you know, special handout opportunities. It's not enough to just recognize, oh, look, I've done so well, because at the same time, simultaneously, the other exclusionary practices are happening. There's so much like invisible racism happening structurally. So you can't just get a cookie for giving somebody like a, you know, like you can't get a cookie for not being racist. You can't just get a cookie or a biscuit and tea service just for like giving somebody, you know, like a thing that in fact you should be giving artists who've got good work. So, you know, that's work you should be doing baseline. It's not a gift.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I also just think it's just a shifting of how we think about influence and power, right? I think that in the arts, it's just been correlated. If you have influence and power, you're valorized, right? You have to maintain some sort of perception of what you are. And I think the vast majority of institutions in the United States and in the West, everywhere, but especially the United States, have to put away their fear of their reputation and their history being questioned, and realize that's not important, and start getting really comfortable with being uncomfortable, having very uncomfortable conversations, having very uncomfortable looks into their history, their works, who they're employing, what systems are at play, and not downplaying this, and not being in the business of trying to protect the institution in this moment from damage of being, you know, having a difficult discussion of what they're about and what they've done and where they're going, right? I mean, it's an opportunity every day to start anew and to say, we're part of this problem. We have this difficulty. We recognize it. These are things we're going to start now by working at it, and stop thinking about influence as something that has to be positive. To me, an institution should be a living, breathing space, right? An open practice. It's about its employees. It's about its position in society, and making that a little less rigid would help. Just bringing down that fear that somehow you are going to tarnish your reputation or legacy or whatever by questioning what you have done and what you're about now.
Excellent. Any final comments from the other panelists before we say goodbye to our wonderful audience who stayed with us, and those who joined in and those who had to leave for classes? I've shared the link on my Viad page that James built for us, so that people can go and view them and use them in their classrooms and in their institutions, so that this conversation can keep going. And in October, I believe it's October the 30th, we are going to have our second in the series of dialogues, and I welcome you to please return so that we can do some more beatdowns and have a lot of fun as well, okay? So thank you so much, everyone. So I'm going to just, I'm just wondering now how to stop stop us from being together anymore. It's time to say goodbye, but I don't know how to end this.
Are you saving the chat too?
I can, but hang on a second. So stop video. Okay. And let's see.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
I just said bye, everyone, and I'm hoping people leave.
Yeah.
I think they're leaving slowly, but I'm just seeing the goodbyes from the people that are here in the chat, which is nice.
Bye, everyone. I know. I don't want to press end because then we also end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Nikila, if you in the call, you can't save the chat, so you have to go in that chat function, and there should be some little ellipses down there at the corner, and you can save it in some type of format.
Yeah. I've been saving it.
James has it. James has it. Okay.
Oh, Charles is here.
Charles, how are you?
Hi, Charles.
All the people we know.
Lori.
So many people who we know are here.
That's great.
So
it's like every time I try to save it, someone posts
3
something.
people left. They need to go so that we can have a fun it's time for like bringing out the single malt and the cheap wine.
What time is it in New York? Because here it's 11 o'clock. It might be a little early.
About 9:30
Yeah.
in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
One thing that I did want to say, I know people are leaving now, but I just love reading about what other artists do and their perspectives. But LaToya Ruby Frazier is one artist that I really, really respect. But in her recent interview, she said, do you want to be remembered for what you've done for other people, or do you want to be remembered for what you've done for yourself? Yeah. And I think that's the big question, that you have to think about in terms of when you're taking that work and you're putting it out, what happens after that. But that was my last response that I was going to say, Neelika.
Some of those things are kind of related, though. I mean, if you think about artists of color, if they get censored, right? If they get pushed out because they're seen as controversial or problematic or a troublemaker, the work they want to do for others is given a smaller platform, right? So I've always understood why some artists have taken a less activist role in this position, or a less vocal role. Those concerns are completely like related, right? But in the same time, that's just the way, that's what the system knows that it can rely on, right? That the vast majority are going to be silent. And they have all the power to make it about something else. They can reframe what you're challenging and discredit you by suggesting it's for X number of reasons, because they have that power. And so that's one of the really, I think historically would have been the most difficult problems, right?
Yeah, when you start to talk about inclusivity, and especially in Britain and British documentary, it's always thrown back at you, well, the cream rises to the top, and if you're good, you'll make it. But without looking at all these systemic structures which are preventing you from rising to the top, it's always your fault you're not making. It's not that people aren't letting you in through the front door, or they're preventing your access to places. It's always the onus is on you in that sense.
I've heard that myth a million times in a different kind of way. It's right. I mean, even when I was in grad school, I remember we had a visiting curator from New York, and he said, the reason why you don't know any of any Black painters because there are no good Black painters. I mean, I think that was like my first week of grad school. I was like, what? What is going on here?
No.
No. That's enough.
That, Sama. That was not so long ago,
Yeah, and things like that keep getting perpetuated in different ways. I mean, we're in so much better of a place right now as a School of Art because we have a much more diverse faculty. I mean, just keep it in perspective, it's still 7 people, and half of those are art historians or in visual culture. They're not in the visual arts. But I think there's 3 of us in the visual arts now in the studio practice. But it's difficult because you go to reviews, and I'm not saying all my faculty members are challenged this way, but you go to reviews of students' work, and these are like incredibly talented, intellectual, challenging work that they make. And this, which is people are supportive, my colleagues are supportive, but I don't know where these messages are coming to them that that work is so out of context. You have to put all this like explanatory text right next to it. You have to you have to do the 101 education on Blackness and Black cartoons and Indigenous experiences. It's like, you don't even get to be an artist. And I'm like, resist that, I'm not saying everybody's saying that to them, but it is, I am a smoker too. So this is my smoker voice,
I'm about to join you outside, Sama. That sounds
right
like a wonderful idea.
I mean, it's only the 32 people listening.
I turned off my camera because I was,
Have the Rizla.
The smoke. Yeah. Okay.
I'm gonna have to turn off my camera when I smoke too. But yeah, and it's I can't believe that it's 2020. I mean, I can believe it, but I can't believe it. But I remember this when I was in graduate school, that I had people saying, well, nobody really understands Israel and Palestine. So you have to like put that all in the work. And I'm like, I mean, is there a country in a conflict more photographed and more in the news than Israel and Palestine? Like, you know, what is this laziness and somehow that this kind of labor, and you can't exist in this space otherwise, because it's like, oh, we don't know what it means, and I think it's political, and that makes me uncomfortable because I don't understand what position I'm supposed to have. So I'm just going to ignore it altogether.
Yeah. So I think it's time to kick out whoever's remaining here.
Or we could just rejoin on a separate chat or a separate call if anyone would like to do that.
I'm happy.
Tamiko. Hi, Tamiko.
Hey, that's your old student, right?
Yeah, now she's a professor at University of Wisconsin.
Hi, Tamiko. Congratulations. I know your name because I know you went to Palestine with Sama, like, you know, like a decade ago. It's so wonderful to hear of your success and your continuing career.
I don't know if she's still here, but I hope so. I hope she heard that.
Oh,
But I'll
she's
tell
back.
her. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I think that's I feel like the most major accomplishments of my career, of how many artists of color I've had as my students and see them now teaching. But it's still a fraction. In all of these places, you're still talking about a fraction. Like what Andrew is saying, it's like, and Zora was saying, and Aaron was saying, I mean, this is tiny. Should we join a new chat?
Yeah, let's do. Okay, people, goodbye.
I'm going to go, but before we all leave, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for participating and sharing. I think this was much needed for not only us, but a lot of people out there, a lot of people saying this has been the best panel that they've attended. I think it's just, you know, a lot of the truth telling has been much needed.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, Amy.
so shall I send you an email with a new Zoom link?
Use the time, that'd be really nice.
Yeah.
Okay, hang on
All
a
right.
second.
All right.
Bye, Amy.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Today's the 30th, right? Okay, people, I just sent you a new